So a few weeks ago I did a video on this $190 mystery spec gaming PC. This was a PC that I bought that I really didn't know much about it. I only knew what the CPU was, which was a 3770K, and the drive configuration, which was a 120 gig SSD and a 1TB hard drive. These are different hard drives, by the way. I didn't know the cooling configuration, I didn't know the power supply, I didn't even know the motherboard or the RAM. But I was pleasantly surprised to see that we have 16 gigs of RAM, water cooling for the 3770K, and well, I'm not so proud of this, but a hopefully decent power supply. However, you might be noticing that it is missing something. It is missing the graphics card. This had a GeForce GTX 660 in it, which is still good for playing some games like Fortnite, Rainbow Six, Minecraft. You can play those games perfectly fine. That's all you wanted to do, but it really struggled at playing a lot of modern games. So I took that and I sold it, and I bought a GPU to replace it. And I actually paid the exact same price for the GPU as I sold the 660 for, so I technically got an upgrade for free, and we'll talk about that new GPU in a little bit. But in that video I said that I'm going to be eventually transforming this PC that looked like it came straight out of 2011, and I'm going to be transforming it into something that looks like it came out this year. I'm also going to be showing you guys how to do it as well, and without further ado, let's begin. So before I go ahead and show you the new parts we're going to be upgrading this to, let me kind of take you through the thought process I have when looking at what to upgrade in an old gaming PC. So for this one, you should probably upgrade the hardware before you upgrade the aesthetics of the computer, but we're already doing that. So the GTX 660, that was the first thing to go, because you really can't do much of the 600 series unless it's like a 680. Then those are still pretty decent, but that 660 had to go. If you're still using the 660, power to you, but I think it might be time to finally upgrade, especially when GPU prices come down whenever they do. Another thing that you'd want to upgrade before you upgrade the aesthetics is probably add in an SSD. I got lucky and mine came with a 120 gig already, so I don't need to do that. And the final thing you probably want to do is, if you only have 8 gigs of RAM or even 4 gigs, you probably want to upgrade to either 12 or 16 gigs of RAM. The reason I say that is because one of the RAM sticks in my main computer died, so I got downgraded to 8 gigs, and pretty much any game I play is a stuttery mess now. So definitely upgrade to 16 if you're still rocking 4 or 8 gigs of RAM. Some other things you can consider upgrading before you swap out the case: if you have an old pre-built, the power supplies are probably pretty iffy and probably aren't going to last much longer at this point, but that's not totally necessary, but I would definitely recommend doing that. Another thing you could definitely upgrade before you upgrade the aesthetics is the CPU. If you have something like a 2400 or a 3470, those are still pretty decent, so you probably wouldn't have to. But if you're rocking like first gen anything, you should probably upgrade the CPU. The motherboard we're going to keep the same, because even though I would like to be able to overclock with the 3770K that we have, I don't think it's worth spending an extra $100 on a Z77 motherboard just to be able to overclock your 3770K. So we're going to leave the motherboard as it is. We're going to leave the cooler as it is. We're going to leave the RAM because we already have 16 gigs. We're going to leave the storage because we actually have an SSD already for the boot device, and the 660 is gone, so we're going to be upgrading that to a different graphics card, which I'll talk about here in a second. So what are the parts that we're going to be swapping this thing out to? Well, I'll show you. So these are the 3 parts that we're going to be changing out to make our old Ibuypower a modern looking gaming PC. We'll get to the case in a second. I bet most of you probably don't recognize it, but first let's get to the graphics card. Now, no, we're not going from a GTX 660 to a 9800 Pro. This is just a placeholder for the GTX 770 that we're going to be upgrading to. This is still a pretty decent card, and considering the tough times that we're having, us PC gamers are crying because we cannot get graphics cards. This is actually not a terrible card, not the 9800, but the 770. The 770 isn't a terrible card and can still play a good amount of game. I've tested it multiple times in the past, and it's still pretty good for gaming. So we'll set this off to the side. This is just a placeholder for the 770. Now, the case. This is an interesting one. You can go with whatever case you want if you're trying to replicate this guide. You can go with whatever case you want, however much RGB or no RGB, whatever. But when I saw this thing listed on Newegg for $50 with 4 RGB fans and a remote control and a clear side panel, which, by the way, it's not glass, it's plastic, acrylic, which is probably a turnoff for most people. But when I saw this case was $50, I was like, why not? This gives me an excuse to try a no-name case. And I really don't even know the name of it, because the company that's being sold by is different from the brand that's in the listing, and the box is different than the brand in the listing. So I don't know what this thing's supposed to be called, but it has a clear side panel, has 4 120 millimeter RGB fans. You can't control them with the motherboard, I believe. You can't, but you do get a remote control, actually right here, the remote. So it comes with 4 fans, 3 in the front and 1 in the rear, and obviously this thing's super cheap, like, obviously, but I wanted to go for aesthetics rather than quality. So this case is really small. I'm going to do a side-by-side comparison of the old NZXT case and this case, and so some downsides with it. Obviously the acrylic, the power supply is top mounted actually, which I'm not sure how I feel about, and from what the reviews say, cable management in this thing is pretty hard. So yeah, this will be fun. The final thing that we're upgrading is the power supply, and I'm sure if I wanted to reuse that Allied power supply I could, and it would probably still last quite a few years, but I have this 500 watt EVGA 80 plus power supply from B-stock that I bought about a month ago, just lying around, so I figured I'd use it. It's at least a refurbished power supply, and it might even outlive the Allied power supply. So I'm going to disassemble the NZXT PC, or the gaming PC that we're transforming. I'm going to put it in here, and I'm going to give you some thoughts on what I think about the PC case, and then we're going to run some benchmarks with the 770. I love when this happens. I love when the freaking standoff is stuck in the screw. It either happens when you use the wrong screw size or you tighten it too much, and I'm gonna assume they tighten it too much. Alright, after 30 minutes of me screaming and swearing, I finally got the stupid standoff that was stuck, and I might have just ever so slightly just nicked the board, just ever so slightly. But there are no traces there, luckily, so I think the board will still work just fine. So hopefully building it goes much smoother than disassembling. Alright guys, that time of the video where I show you how well this GTX 770 and 3770K can play modern games. We're going to be doing the same games and settings as we did with the previous configuration of this PC, which was the 3770K and the 660. So, first up we have Fortnite. At 1080p low settings, we got a pretty decent 155 FPS average. This is quite a bit more than the GTX 660 was able to do, but the GTX 660 was still able to play Fortnite at 1080p competitive settings perfectly fine. But the FPS boost from the GTX 770 is nice, especially if you want to run, say, a 144Hz or 165Hz monitor. Not sure why you would if you have a GTX 770, but hey, maybe you're waiting for a nice GPU and you just want to be able to play Fortnite, then you could consider the GTX 770 as a good option if you're waiting for a more expensive GPU. If you wanted a game to look better without sacrificing too much in FPS, then running Fortnite on GTX 770 at 1080p medium settings is definitely a good option. With an average of 110 FPS, it is quite a bit more than the GTX 660 was. Both were still playable at 1080p medium settings though. Up next is CSGO, and at 1080p low settings we got an average of 180 FPS. That's definitely very good, although it's not much more than the GTX 660 was. However, the GTX 660 had a really weird issue where if there were one or two people on screen, the GTX 660 would start to struggle and cause the game to start stuttering. However, with the 770, that issue is no longer there, so I would say that this is definitely a major improvement over the GTX 660. Up next on the benchmarking list, we have Minecraft, and I'm running Minecraft here with the fancy graphics settings and the 12 chunk render distance, and we are getting well over 400 FPS in a standard survival world. When we had the GTX 660 installed, we were getting well over 200 FPS, which is perfectly fine for Minecraft, but with the 770 installed, we seem to have been able to easily get well over 400 FPS in a standard survival world. Now, if you're playing on a Minecraft server, your average FPS may go down a lot compared to a standard survival world, but if you're just planning on playing regular survival, then this PC is more than capable of doing that. Up next is Rainbow Six Siege, and at 1080p medium settings using the built-in benchmark, we got an average of 90 FPS. Now when you're in an actual game, your average will probably be a little bit less, but if we compare it to the GTX 660, there is indeed a pretty decent bump in performance. It's not as big as other games were, but it's still a bump in performance nevertheless. And for the last game tested on the system, we have Grand Theft Auto 5. At 1080p normal settings, we're getting an average of around 75 FPS. Now when I tested this on GTX 660, I might have accidentally left VSync on, but either way, this game was still very playable on both of these graphics cards. And finally, I ran 3D Mark Time Spy on both the GTX 660 and the GTX 770, and on Time Spy combined with the 3770K, we got about an 800 point increase going from the GTX 660 to the GTX 770. And there we have it. If you made it to the end of this video, congratulations, because this video is much longer than the ones I normally do, and I'm tired of editing this, so I want to get this done and out. Basically, in this video, I've shown you how you could technically replicate this at home by finding an old gaming PC for super cheap, adding some key upgrades to it, like maybe a new graphics card, maybe an SSD for faster boot times and load times in games, and maybe even throw a new case on it to get some of that nice RGB. Now let me talk to you a little bit about this case. It's called the H60 I think I remembered it correctly. It's that brand name, whatever that brand name is, C001. It's super cheap on Newegg. It's like $50 on Newegg, and comes with 4 RGB fans with remote control. The good things about it, the RGB obviously looks incredible. It's super light, so if you wanted to ship this gaming PC, if you were selling it online, then your shipping cost would be a lot less. And that's about all of the good things I have for it. So let's talk about the bad things. Putting an ATX motherboard into this case is definitely a bit of a stretch, as the ATX motherboard will cover up most of the cable management holes. For me, the power supply would not line up with the screws in the rear of the case, so I had to kind of like morph the case a little bit to be able to get the power supply screws to line up. And cable management in the rear is pretty hard, although because the case is so cheap, the rear panel can easily be bent into shape to fit with the cables. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, if you leave a like, subscribe. It's definitely a much longer video. If you made it to the end of this video, congratulations, can't believe you did it, and I'll see you guys next time, because I'm going to bed.